Take two.
All right. So we're going to kind of go through the packet. I'm planning to do this today and Friday. So if we end up, wherever we end today, we'll pick up from there on Friday, and hopefully we'll be at a good pace, so we can get through this whole packet this week. So if we do like half of this, I'd like to get through about a little bit more if possible, and I think that would be the best situation. So let's get started. So so period 1 is not a ton of your AP exam, so I do want to make sure you know it, so that anything that does come up on it, you have strong knowledge. But we'll try to get through it rather quickly. If you feel like, Mr. I'm good. Let's move on. Let's go to the next thing. Just tell me, all right? So key concept 1 is basically just looking at the early humans. There's really not a ton of that on the AP exam. So you should know that there are different, hominids that existed in prehistoric times and Paleolithic times, but it's really more focused on Homo sapiens, the fact that they had tool use, the impact that had on development, the very beginnings of technology. There's not really too much on like Neanderthals and things like that. There was interaction between those early hominids and humans, but really it's focused on the Homo sapiens themselves, early humans. Some key technologies they had. This one's not on here, but I think it's important. The eye needle is really cool. It's my favorite early technology. You can actually sew and connect different fabrics together. The one they always talk about for whatever reason, I think is use of fire. So fire to cook your food because it allows you to process it. You're not eating raw meat and break things down better. Get more energy, more nutrients, and that's just going to help the growth of the species. Obviously, adapting to new environments, part of that is the clothing, technology improving. How do people live during the Paleolithic age? What kind of lifestyle do they have?
Hunter-gatherers. Nomadic.
So yeah, hunter-gatherers and nomadic, right? Those two things. Nomadic, hunter-gatherers. So they existed through that kind of means. They lived in bands, right? Small groups. Not this kind of band, but groups of 30 to 40 people living cooperatively together. We know some things that we know about this because we study still existing nomadic hunter-gatherer peoples, right? Gives us maybe a clue as to how they live. And of course, hunted. Early evidence of religion, animistic kind of traditions, believing in nature, ancestors, and led by shamans, priests, who would communicate with the people, communicate with the spirits, with nature, and be able to kind of pass that information on. But the key thing is that, like you guys said, they're nomadic hunter-gatherers. But even then, there's an exchange of ideas. We got to go through that, so I don't get any copyright issues. You see, cave paintings is evidence of the technology, the abilities that they had. But very quickly, we can get to development of farming. Why does farming start?
Because in a lot of places there were sparse amounts of food, and as the winter came, they needed a more substantial and always their source food.
More reliable
Yes.
sources, right? So I'm not going to get too much into it because I don't think the AP exam is going to be too concerned about it. But suffice to say that winter always came, right? It happens every year, and all those other winters farming didn't result. So we think that probably there was some major changes in the environment. First, to make things easier, so people could get comfortable with that, and then to make things more difficult. So Levant, which is right the eastern Mediterranean coast in the Middle East, that's where farming first started. It actually emerged independently in many different places around the world. What I mean by that is that different people had the same invention without getting the idea from each other. But this is the first place that it exists, and it seems to be that witness of the Natufians. There seems to have been some warming that took place that made life really easy for them, and they were able to settle even before they started farming. So they were settled hunter-gatherers, sedentary hunter-gatherers. But as the climate then turned for the worse and started getting colder and drier again, they were already used to being settled, so they tried to come up with an alternative to hunting and gathering that would enable people to stay in one place, not have to travel, but be able to produce enough food. And so farming develops. This is my reenactment of the changes in the climate. Cold Canadian glacial water hitting the Arctic Ocean messes up the global climate. But it leads to the development of farming, right? It's not something that they picked up overnight. It was originally done as a temporary measure or a secondary supplemental measure to get access to food, but eventually they're going to take this and become the primary means of food production. So the big term to understand with this is domestication, right? They are taking plants and eventually animals, but for the first 1,000 years or so, it's just plants. They're taking plants that already exist in nature and they're breeding them, right? That's what domestication is all about. Over multiple generations of the plant, which you can imagine is quicker than with animals, right? Generation, season to season, versus over a lifetime. But they breed the plant. They plant the ones that have the best qualities, and so over time they generate certain qualities, certain traits within those plants. So corn is one, or maize. You should know that term, maize, M-A-I-Z-E, as for corn. One of the hardest things to domesticate, but it was done by the people in Mesoamerica to create a corn that has actually a lot of food to it, and we can eat. Question? No, just like amazed. Yeah, it's pretty crazy, right? And of course, same thing with animals. They're going to domesticate animals to be more docile, to be more calm, to not have horns that can kill you, right? Wheat, so that it can be hardier and it won't just fall on the floor and get eaten by some other animals. They want to make sure that it stays in the wheat, so they can get that out when they're ready to eat it. So they're basically taking over for evolution, right? Humans take over for evolution and conduct that process themselves to make it suitable to them, not necessarily the survival of the plant or the animal, right? So that's how it becomes domesticated, when its evolution has taken a new path to be beneficial to humans rather than beneficial to their own survival. As John Green said in one of his videos, it turns out that one of the most valuable traits for survival and the expansion of your species is to be delicious. Right? Because if you're delicious, humans will make sure that your species lives on, right, and continues to grow. So we have now the development of these new civilizations in a lot of different places all around the world. So it starts in the Middle East, but you can see a nice map up here. All around the world we have the development of new crops and new domesticated animals, right? So some of the big spots are, we have a couple places in Africa, in East Africa and West Africa, development of agriculture, sorghum, wheat. In Europe and around the Black Sea, domestication of animals is spreading. China, Indus River, in South America and Central America, right? You said maize is the big one for Central America and Mesoamerica. Potatoes are the big development for South America, right? The potatoes developed there. Rice is not actually a big deal in northern China. In the beginning, it's really in the south. In the north, it's more millet and other forms of grain. But the point is that this idea of agriculture didn't start in one place and spread, but it popped up independently in different places. And it's based on what types of animals and what types of plants wildly existed in those places, and then we can domesticate them. Which, if you guys remember last year, we talked about Eurasia had a real advantage over places like Africa and the Americas. They just, by, you can call it geographic luck, they had more animals and plants that worked well to be domesticated. And so they have an advantage, and we see in the last thousands of years of history that really gave Europe and Asia an advantage over other parts of the world in developing and ultimately having a lot of domination over the world. So pastoralism, what is pastoralism? Any of you guys know this? Nomadic pastoralists or pastoral nomads? People at home are waiting. Yeah.
So nomadic pastoralists are when there's it's kind of like the hunter-gatherer tribes, but they have like the animals, and then they domesticate them, and then they follow them around.
Yeah, absolutely. So So you keep the nomadic part, but not the hunter-gatherer part, right? So the pastoral is another word for herders, right? Pastoral, pasture, right? The pasture is the grassland, right? So they take their animals on the road. So you have those people who became sedentary agriculturalists, settled farmers. They have plants and animals, right? So they have to. What do animals have that plants don't? A lot of things. The one thing that's important, legs, right? Plants don't have legs, therefore they can't move. So you can't take them with you, right? If you plant the crop and then you go, oh, maybe I should move. The plant lives here now. It's got to be here for months until it's a grown plant, right? So if you just do animals, then you're still mobile. So while some people are going to start settling and creating these early settlements, right? The nomadic people, they're going to be nomadic pastoralists are going to stay nomadic. So we have a real thing that's basically dependent on the geography. If you live in an area that's very fertile, what are you going to do?
Crops.
Yeah, you're going to farm, you're going to grow crops. But if you don't have an area that's good for that, but there's enough fertility to grow grass, you don't grow grass, the grass grows itself, right? Then you can at least take up this idea of pastoralism. So those two kind of worlds are going to exist. We know, if you look at the map, right, you can see that a lot of this, at least in Afro-Eurasia, is kind of centered around that middle section, right? But if you go farther north, up in what we call you guys remember what the grassland is called across Eurasia?
Eurasian stuff.
The steppe, very good, STEPPE. The people who live there, it's just a better place to be a pastoralist than a sedentary agriculturalist, right? And you see similar things in the Americas, although there's less in the Americas of pastoralism because virtually none, because what do they lack?
Animals.
Very good. There's very few domesticable animals, and none that are labor animals, with what exception? Alpaca and their close relative, llama, right? And that's only in the Andes in South America, so it doesn't really spread. Because as Jared Diamond pointed out, that northwest axis, it's really hard to get alpacas to culturally diffuse through Panama and rainforests just to make it. They would have been great in the Rockies, I'm sure. The Appalachian Mountains would have been very useful, but you have to go through a lot of different environments to get there.
Can I borrow your key?
Yeah.
Little time, Mikey. Yeah, thank you. If you want. Okay.
How are we doing so far?
Good.
So, yeah, it says, they have to work collaboratively to clear land and create water control systems. So there's a lot of discussion around this development of civilization, right? We go to farming, and then from there we go to the idea of civilization. What do we mean by civilization, and how do we go from just farming to going to civilization? Any thoughts at all? Yes, you hit the right word, man. Having a surplus, right? So, but how do we get a surplus, right? So there's different methods. I have a really elaborate, it's things you can't really see it because the arrows are in black. But once you get that domestication of plants and animals, if you're in a river valley or an otherwise very fertile place, you have the fertility already to get that surplus going. And then you want to keep it going, because once you get a surplus, what happens?
Division of labor.
Specialization.
That's all true, but what's other than that? Maybe the most simple thing that happens when you have more food,
More people.
more people, right? What are you going to say? Population growth, right? So if you have population growth, then suddenly what happens to that surplus?
It goes down.
It's not a surplus anymore, right? The people will make babies, and will meet you at that surplus, and then you have to make more surplus, right? So as that kind of process continues, humans have to say, okay, wait, how do we do this even better now? We have more population pressure. We need to increase our surplus. What can we use? So you're going to see things like irrigation systems. That's probably the most popular and the one that we think of most right away. But new tools, right? New farming methods, and the cheating way, slavery, right? That's how we cheat to increase the surplus agricultural production. Get other people to do it for us. But all those things are going to have that effect, which of course leads to more population, and then this cycle continues. So one of the reasons why, one of the theories behind the development of civilization is we need a system like when it comes to governments and things like that, we need people to organize these systems that we put in place to continually increase surplus. Does that make sense? So the more we're going to increase surplus, the more organized we need to get. To be organized, we need to work together, and we develop, governments and all these systems. That's one theory as to the development of. Thank you. Another part of it, which I won't get too much into, but also is the idea of war and conflict. As people have conflict with each other, they need to defend themselves. So you develop more systems to do that, to control within your population. And that idea of state control also plays an important role in the development of civilizations. And remember, not every civilization is the same. Each civilization kind of has its own story. One might have developed more around irrigation. Another one might have developed more around warfare, things like that. We hit everything. You guys mentioned job specialization, right? So I think it's a little bit lower on here. But I think since we just brought it up, we might as well talk about it. We jump down to, so we can skip over where it's talking about pastoralism and just head to A at the very bottom of this page. Because I think, is that where it's talking about? Oh, no, sorry, C. In the middle of the page, patriarchy and social stratification. So A is social stratification and C is patriarchy. So those are two really big elements that come up here, right? So once we get surplus, you guys said what happens? Job specialization, right? So population increase, job specialization. What does that both lead to? If you want to have a bunch of different people doing a lot of different jobs, where do you live?
Town.
Yeah, town. Or even bigger?
City.
So what do we call that process? Making people going from living in little tiny farming villages to towns, cities. Urbanization, right? So urbanization, growth of cities. Life is getting more complex. Some people have to be farmers, specialization of labor. As you get specialization of labor, you get merchants, people who are going to conduct trade, soldiers to protect from human threats, priests to protect from natural threats, right? When there's a drought, when there's floods, you can't use soldiers to protect from the flood. You can build systems, but you can also appeal to the divine forces, and you need priests to do that. Rulers to maintain order, to collect taxes. Eventually, we'll touch on this, but scribes, and all of this leads to these development of these larger systems, right? But there's two kind of negative things that come out of all of these neutral or positive developments that help society function and the development of civilization, and that is social stratification and patriarchy. So social stratification is a little bit more obvious. Why does job specialization lead to social stratification?
Because not everyone needs to work on farming, and there can be more organization that can be done.
So that's job specialization, right? But why does that almost always lead to social stratification? Social stratification meaning people are not seen as equal in society.
There needs to be a leader.
Okay, so so two extremes, right? Slavery as a cheating way of getting more surplus and avoiding having to do certain work. At the very top, having a leadership, that person's valued more. But even in the middle,
some jobs are just more valued than others.
Mm-hmm. So, like what?
Like soldiers more important than a peasant farmer.
Why are they more important?
Because they protect the society.
But farmers feed the society. So why are soldiers more important? Why are soldiers more valuable than farmers?
Because they have surplus.
I was kind of thinking that there's there's less soldiers and more slaves. So if you look at it, like one soldier is more worth than like 4 slaves or something.
Right. So numbers plays a significant role in this. Like, if you lose one farmer, there's like a lot of farmers.
Yeah.
So as a group, collectively, we value the farmer so important. But one individual farmer is like kind of worthless. Right? Like, who are you? You're nobody. But if you're a soldier, you're from an elite group. You're from a special group. Oh wow, you're one of the soldiers. Right? So because you have the few, the proud, the Marines, right? It's the few, right? That's the idea that not everybody can do this. Not everybody can be a soldier. Your default is farmer. Wow, you have something special. You're a soldier, right? The higher you go up, scribes, right? If you have a special skill, you can write. Scribes, I always say, are like a combination in like our modern context is like a combination of lawyers and people who do code, like who write code. So it's kind of both at the same time. They know this special code, they know this special system that can encode information, we are familiar with writing at a time when that was something very unique, and they're lawyers, they're accountants, anything that requires dealing with information, they are the ones doing that, and they have special skills, so they have a higher status, right? Pretty support, right? Their role in society is unique, and there are a few of them that can fulfill it. Patriarchy is a little bit trickier. Any theories on it's? I feel like patriarchy is both more obvious and also less obvious. Why do some people were asking this in the Q&A the other day, and you guys were saying why was there more egalitarianism during Paleolithic times? So how does patriarchy happen? Any thoughts? It's okay to be wrong.
Women are staying at home, bearing children, taking care of the house and the children, while men have to go out to more working jobs.
Okay, you want to answer that?
And also going back to like the value of soldiers, women have to stay home with like the kids and or get pregnant and things, so they can't stay out in the war and fight all the time, whereas men can.
Right. So there's an obvious kind of biological element to it that it's not. I don't think it's so much about strength as it is about childbearing. Women can have children, men can't. Also, nursing is you can do 9 months being pregnant, and then however long after nursing, right? And they don't have formula back then, so it is what it is. That's the only way that baby can grow, right? And so when there's especially war, because especially war is like a very immediate thing. We gotta go. We can't wait till later. Like war has to happen now. We're getting invaded. So men take on that role. It becomes stereotyped as a male-dominated role. Many roles, because women are often in the home, it's like, don't worry, you stay there, and men become dominant in a lot of different fields because of that. So in our society today, like we're trying to address that to counteract those forces that because it's a scale issue, right? If you're in a group of 30 people, if you're a band of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, it's not going to feel that extreme. Like one person in your band is currently pregnant or currently nursing, other people pick up the slack and support them, right? But when you have a huge city or city-state, right? It's too small of an issue, and people go, it would just be simpler if we just have the men do it, right? So to kind of simplify things, they go, okay, when then the women just you guys stay home, men will do these important jobs, but that becomes normalized, and then women are not seen as important, men are more valued. And you mentioned military, right? We know that in societies, scholars tell us that in societies that have more war, more what?
Patriarchy.
Mm-hmm. So that really is interesting. The more that people get invaded, the more there's conflict, the more likely they are to have a more male-dominated society because like macho, we talk like fascism and stuff like that. That kind of mentality tends to be very masculine-dominated, and when things are more peaceful and they don't have to put as much of an emphasis on soldiers, then there's more gender equality, more egalitarian. One other thing was the technology. So pottery is an important technology. That goes way back. Pottery is awesome for historians and archaeologists because we can tell a lot about civilizations from their pottery. They have different styles, different techniques. It's hand thrown or it's put on a wheel, right? Decorated versus plain. Different little things we can tell because pottery, unlike gems and jewels and stuff like that, was less valuable in the long term, especially broken pottery. If somebody breaks a pot, what are you gonna do with it? Throw it out, right? But for archaeologists to find pottery shards, that's really useful. We can tell about a lot of the especially early civilizations where we don't have writing. They're grouped or they're named by the type of pottery that we found around them. Right? When we see a change in the pottery, we go, it's a new group. Other technologies that are important, the wheel and bronze. Bronze is used originally the first metal that was used was copper, but copper's pretty soft compared to bronze, so we mix it with tin, and you make a stronger metal. Tin is harder to find than copper, but the process is not as complicated to mix them and make them as, for example, iron, right? Talk about iron. Iron comes later. Iron is easier to find, but less obvious of how to process it and turn it into like a usable metal. So bronze is like the early metal that's really important. but it's not available to everybody because it's very pricey. And the wheel is a huge deal. Wheels, we seem obvious to us now, like writing, but the wheel enabled moving things from place to place. Started out as people rolling things over logs, and they said, well, we got to keep taking the log and putting it to the other side and rolling on that side and take the log again. Why don't we just kind of connect the log to the thing we're on, and eventually that's how wheels were created, to sort of get something that can roll. And you can, but think about the impact that's going to have on trade, transportation, being able to move things, right? When you guys do physics, you dragging something versus wheeling something, right? You take a lot of the load off. So the big river valley civilizations that, so the big river valley civilizations that we focus on are which ones?
Indus River Valley.
Okay, Indus River Valley, where is that? Indus Valley Civilization, that's the biggest one actually. There was we talked about in class, there was a second river, we think, that made it so fruitful and so populous. Mesopotamia is probably the most famous river valley civilization. What are the rivers?
Tigris.
And Nile River, what civilizations?
Nubia.
Thank you. Egypt and Nubia, right? Nubia to the south. So let's see. So for Indus River Valley, I think we'll come back to Mesopotamia. Let's look at Indus River Valley. So Indus River Valley, right? It's in modern-day Pakistan and a little bit of India. They were the largest one. One of the things we know about them, or I should say we don't know, their writing has never been deciphered. So they had writing, but we can't read it. But we do know that they traded with Mesopotamia because we have the seals. We found their seals, these little tiny pieces of clay in Mesopotamia. So we know that trade was taking place. As I said in the Q&A the other day, there was also trade between Egypt and Nubia, between Egypt and Mesopotamia. So this whole world was very connected, especially in the later Bronze Age. They were very advanced. They had streets that were aligned in a grid pattern. They had standard weights and measures. The Great Bath was their great architectural achievement, but we still don't know a lot about their civilization. They're also known as the Harappan. That was in the Q&A. People said, what is the Harappan? As the Harappan civilization. They ended up declining mostly due to natural causes. We talked about it in class last year that there seems to have been another river there that possibly dried up and left them with less surplus. So if you have less surplus, everything else goes down with it, right? Population, job specialization, and the civilization just declines, and people couldn't do what they used to be able to do. Egypt, like we said, down here to the south, we have Nubia as well. So those civilizations have constant interaction with each other and also conflict. Yeah. Question? Of course, we know the pyramids, right? The religious element of this. Their rulers were considered to be what? The pharaohs were considered gods, right? So we see that on A at the bottom here. You want to add that on here. It says, states where powerful new systems ruled, mobilized surplus labor over large areas. Rulers in early states often claimed divine connection to power, right? They also relied on military or religious or aristocratic elites. So Egypt is like the easiest, most obvious example where they are claiming divine status. Other rulers might not say they are literally gods, but they usually say that they have some kind of a special relationship with the gods. Gilgamesh, right, was supposed to be connected to the gods. We talk about Hammurabi in Mesopotamia in the Babylonian civilization. He was said to have gotten his laws from the gods that we have hanging up on the classroom photo of Hammurabi. There's on the left Hammurabi receiving the laws from the god. I don't remember if it was Shamash or who it was from. Shamash was a sun god. I don't want to. Don't at me on that. He was very tall. So we gotta go back. China, the Shang River Valley. There's really not a lot to say, honestly, about early China because some of the more famous civilizations don't come up until a little bit later, and they were kind of late to the game. But they did develop agriculture independently, and we think they also developed writing independently. It has something called the Oracle Bone Script, and so there's only a couple. There's only 3 times, maybe 2, maybe 3 times that writing is ever developed independently. Let me jump ahead so we don't lose our spot, because they have this on. We have it on here where we have the different civilizations, but then with like valuable information about them, it goes to the next page. So on the back, 3b. If you guys look at 3b, it talks about record keeping. So we, like I said, we'll kind of jump around the packet as we find like good places to fill things in. China developed, we think, independently a system of writing, meaning they didn't get the idea from Mesopotamia or anybody else, and it's called the Oracle Bone Script. It was used originally to interpret like fortune telling. But what's the earliest writing there ever was? Say it louder. Cuneiform, right, or cuneiform, in where's that from? Mesopotamia. What's the civilization? Because Mesopotamia is the region. The first civilization in Mesopotamia. Sumer. Very good. Sumerians. Cuneiform. The first ever writing is wedge-shaped script. Like we said before, writing is so valuable because it allows you to record information. What's the number one reason to have writing? Not for love letters. It's not for sending texts.
Mark amounts for trading.
Yeah, trade is the number one reason to have writing, right? So if you want to put that under B6, systems record keeping in 3B. So first, it's about trade, right? Keeping record of what you sold, what you've purchased, inventory. Once it's invented, it's probably number 2 thing is tax collection, right? Governments say, hey, we could use this. That's why we're going to hire scribes. I want to make sure it's also related to like goods, right, and wealth. I want to make sure that I'm getting all the taxes from the people that I'm supposed to be getting. And what were taxes being taken in during this time?
Goods.
Yeah, particularly probably what?
Could be crops.
Yeah, like grain mostly, right? Because I mean, you're not going to take like part of a cow, right? But grain, we can store it for a certain amount of time, and it's easy to kind of like measure how much we have. We've taken this much. So generally, you had to give a portion of grain. Different societies had different systems of taxation or some kind of collectivism, like certainly not. It's not communism or socialism, but it has to share some qualities with that, right? Either it was taxed by the government and they did what they wanted with it, or it was more communal where it would be redistributed, things like that. Early Sumeria was more redistributive, more communal, proto-socialistic. I think socialism is an anachronism here. Later systems, later governments that came in, like the Akkadians and others, were more like aggressive. And I mean, they were conquerors, so they were like, no, you just give me it, and we'll figure out what we want to do with these crops. Let me know if I like skip over stuff. Shang Dynasty, we said, is in the Yellow River. So the Yellow River, really, China starts out in northern China. The south later becomes important, but right now it's not a major center of these kind of early civilizations. And the Olmec and the Chavin culture in South America, they don't need you to know a lot about it, honestly. There's some things you can review, but the Olmecs are, the biggest thing that they want you to know is that they were like the start of what became later civilizations in those regions. So the Olmec in Mesoamerica and the Chavin culture, pretty sure it's pronounced right, in the Andes Mountains. So the Olmecs are famous for
Heads.
yeah, the giant Olmec heads, right? We don't know what they're depicting, probably rulers, possibly gods. It seems to suggest that people had this may fall into that similar situation with the pharaohs, right? Where people venerated their rulers as gods. We don't know that for sure, but it seems to suggest that may be the case based on the archaeological evidence. We don't have as much information about cultures of Mesoamerica and South America, or the Americas in general, because with one exception, what do they not have to tell us?
Writing.
Yeah, they don't have writing. The Olmec civilization did develop an early form of writing. I'm not sure if it was developed by the Olmec or the Maya. I think that the Olmec kind of started it very initially. The Maya developed it further, and then later the Aztec would develop it even more. But it never spread to other parts of the Americas. So it was, not really. I want to tell you all about the Chavin culture, but there's not that much we know. What we know we can only take from archaeological evidence. But what's worth noting is that they kind of set the tone. The Olmecs set the tone for the Maya and the Aztecs. The Chavin culture set the tone for other cultures that would come later, like the Nazca, the Moche or Mochica, and eventually the big ones like the Aztecs in Mexico and the Inca in Peru. Let's see. I think we hit everything in I, so Roman numeral 1. So let's go back to the side. We said did we hit A? I think we said a few things about A. Is there anything else we can come back to? As they screw the computer for land and resources. So territorial expansion and conquering surrounding states, right? So this is, it's the general concepts that are really important. It's like we said in class today, we want to have specifics that we can reference. But we don't need to, I don't think we need to say too much about this. We can point out that in Mesopotamia, they got invaded a lot because if you look at where they are, the areas around Mesopotamia are less fertile, right? But they're enough that they can sustain pastoral populations, right? Whereas with Egypt, like pretty much when you leave the river, it's what? Yeah, it goes very abrupt from like awesome fertile stuff to like nothing, right? Mesopotamia is a little more gradual. So up here, like in the north of Mesopotamia, you have mountains, right? So there's a lot of people live up in the hills, the hill people, and they live more simply. And then in the south, you have like people who are going more towards the desert, some nomadic people in the desert. They're both going to want to invade, and constantly Mesopotamia is getting invaded. They don't have really natural barriers to that. And so you have the Sumerians, but then they get conquered by the Akkadians. The Akkadians are like the first big kingdom. It's probably in there somewhere. But the Akkadians then get conquered by the Babylonians, which gives us the Code of Hammurabi, right? And the Babylonians get conquered by the Assyrians, iron technology, and they get conquered by the Neo-Babylonians. And it's constantly changing hands, right? They obviously have a lot of overlap in their culture, but they are always getting conquered, right? And the goal is to take over more territory, and eventually, something like Sumer was only city-states. They never had an empire. They had a similar civilization, right? They shared culture, they shared language, they shared religious beliefs, but they were not united as one state. Whereas the Akkadians would actually unite as a state. So this was Sumer right here, right? And it wasn't one empire. It was just these are the different little city-states, each one independent. The Akkadians took over pretty much the entirety of Mesopotamia, right? And we'll skip pastoralists disseminating new weapons. I'll come back to that on C. So monumental architecture, urban planning, the development of temples, of government buildings, right? Often it was a way of showing their power, showing their wealth, their prestige. The pyramids are an obvious example of that. The ziggurats in Mesopotamia. We mentioned record keeping already and why that's important. And the legal codes that I was coming back to. There we go. So there's the Code of Hammurabi. Really regret not taking more photos of this. Yeah. In the moment, it was just like, oh, that's awesome, Code of Hammurabi. Now I look back, I don't know if I'll ever be that close to the real Code of Hammurabi again. But the Code of Hammurabi is a big deal. It's not the only early law code. There's also Ur-Nama, but you don't need to know like much about that. If you ever see the name, just know it's another law code, and that's pretty much, I think, all you need to know about it. But Hammurabi is obviously the most famous one, and there were other law codes in other places. This is just one that really takes the attention. But the idea is it provides order to society and keeps things organized. And it's consistent, right? It's like fair for everybody. Well, it's not fair for everybody, but at least the same laws are being applied in theory, throughout the empire, instead of people who are in charge kind of making up rules as they go. And it says it reflected existed hierarchies, right? So we know what was, with the Code of Hammurabi, was it a fair law code?
No.
So how did it treat people differently?
With slaves or lesser people, they got, when they hurt, people who were more valued in society, who had better jobs, they got more severely punished, whereas when someone would hurt their own slave, they would only have to pay a fine, and, the slave would get killed for hurting a master.
someone of a lower status hurting someone of a higher status, they're going to have really severe punishment. Someone from a higher status going after somebody from a lower status is going to be minimal. If a noble attacks out the eye of a noble, it's supposed to be even. Your eye gets taken out, right? The laws were patriarchal and socially stratified, reflects the society that they were in. New religious belief. Don't forget, guys, that C that we skipped. If I go too far, if I go like deep into the next page, just remind me to go back and address that one. So, new religious beliefs. I still feel like we're a little bit jumping all over the place, but that's why we're kind of going through this quickly. So some religions that are important. Now, there are all of these religions, with the exception of maybe Zoroastrianism. No, even Zoroastrianism. They all developed further later. So this is like the origins of them. Don't feel you have to write all this down. I just threw this in because it was like an old slide and had some images on it. But the ones that they mention here are the Vedic religion, Hebrew monotheism, and Zoroastrianism. So you'll notice for those first two, they say Vedic religion, but they don't say what? What does Vedic religion turn into?
Hinduism.
Hinduism, yeah, good. I'm just whispering in the back. And Hebrew monotheism turns into what?
Judaism.
Right, but they don't say that because it's not Judaism yet. It's not Hinduism yet. It's the early kernel of it, but it isn't quite there. So the things that we should know about, let's start with Hebrew monotheism. So a lot of it is that we know is based on the Bible, which is obviously a religious source. So it's not treated as like it's not a document of history. It's a historical source, but it's not someone wrote this down as a historical narrative. It's a religious narrative. So we have to take that with a grain of salt. But the traditional narrative is you had people who were originally from the Middle East. At some point, they migrated to Egypt, and the story of Moses, right? The Hebrews fleeing oppression in Egypt and coming back to a land that their ancestors had been from, which is, we talked about this a lot recently. We talked about Israel and Palestine, right? This is that history that kind of informs the religious dimensions of that conflict. Yeah, so they settled in the area of this kingdom of Israel, all right? We don't know for sure that it was necessarily this big. This is what the traditional narrative tells us. Scholars disagree about, maybe they were kind of overemphasizing it. But we know that there are records that mention this kingdom existing and it having some kind of power in the region. So, I think it's cool to think of the ancient Israelites as to remember that they are just another Middle Eastern people from the ancient world and interacting with others around them. This didn't last very long, the kingdom of Israel, according to the biblical narrative, which was ruled by David and Solomon, who were considered prophets, like Moses was. But eventually it broke up into two smaller kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. Both of them were quickly conquered by neighboring peoples, and I say quickly, but over the course of a few centuries. The north was conquered by the Neo-Assyrians, who had a very powerful empire based on iron technology, and the kingdom of Judah said, you guys have conquered. And then they got conquered by the Neo-Babylonians, also known as the Chaldeans. And the famous thing with them is that they got taken to Persia. They got taken to the Babylonian Empire, essentially, right, Iraq. And when the Persians came in and conquered, did I have any slide about that? No. When the Persians came in and took over under Cyrus, he freed them and allowed them to go back to their homeland to rebuild the temple that was destroyed by the Neo-Babylonians, which would again be destroyed later in history by
The Romans.
Sorry, I meant to smile at that. That's very good. I'm just smiling that you knew. Zoroastrianism is obviously not as big of a religion in the world today, although it does still exist. Zoroastrianism, though, is probably most noteworthy for two things. One, it was one of the earliest forms of semi-monotheism. It wasn't exactly monotheistic, depending on how you interpret it. People usually call it dualistic because they believed in. So the founder was a guy named Zoroaster or Zarathustra, which is where we get the name of it. He believed that there was one God. He used the name Ahura Mazda, like the car company, right? But he also believed in a evil figure called Angra Mainyu or Ahriman. You're depicted as a hungry lion. You're depicted as some scary, weird, hard nightmare. Whether or not this character is another god, like a second god, a good god and a bad god, or more of like a devil character, depends on your interpretation. But certainly, scholars feel like this was like an early influence. that influenced Judaism and then eventually Christianity and Islam as well. Kind of shared some very similar beliefs, and that's why a lot of people feel, there's a lot of significance to this religion, even though it wasn't that big. The other reason is because it was connected to the Persian empires. So the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Cyrus, this religion was practiced and to a certain extent was reinforced by the government, and in later Persian empires it would play an important role.
Didn't they believe with this religion that in the end, the good God they would be battling for like millennia, and then eventually it would end with the good God winning, and that would be like the end of the world?
Yeah, it's kind of big, like Armageddon battle, right? So you see a lot of the similar themes in Christian and Abrahamic in general, right? Judaism, Christianity, and Islam teachings. The priests, you guys maybe know the Magi from the story baby Jesus, right? In the Bible, the wise men or the kings, depending on how they're being referred to, or the Magi. These essentially supposed to be Zoroastrian priests, or at least Zoroastrians that were there. Again, that's the biblical narrative, so we take it as a religious source, but at least that reference you can keep in mind. The Vedic religion, so we talked about the Indus River Valley, right? The original people in the Indus Valley. We don't know what language they spoke because we can't read their writing. Guess is that it was probably related to the South Indian languages today that are called Dravidian languages. But now we have the migration in 13-ish hundreds BCE of the Aryans from basically northern Iran, Central Asia. They had settled some similar groups. People had settled in parts of the Middle East, but they migrate down into India and they bring their culture and they bring their religious beliefs. And with that process, a new kind of religious belief forms called the Vedic religion. Vedic because it's based around what texts? The Vedas, yeah. So the Vedas, and it's very focused on ritual. There are many different gods, polytheistic, as many of the religions are almost all of them, with a few exceptions in this early period. And they mix the Aryan gods with the local gods, and you get a whole bunch of different gods. The priests who lead the religion are called Brahmins, which is not to be confused with Brahman, which is the concept of a kind of the ultimate reality, the ultimate God above all the gods, off by one letter. Or to be confused with Brahma was a different god. But the Brahmins are the priests, and they're the top of what system?
Caste system.
Caste system, yeah. So you have this system that we think originally started as... Actually, we were just talking about recently with the Hutus and Tutsis, right? A division that starts as a social, job division, and then becomes very fixed. Obviously, not exactly the same situation. Actually, in some ways, that's backwards because we think, at least in part, that this was a little bit ethnic or racial. Not that it was the only factor, and not everyone agrees on this, but it seems like this, three-part division is very common among among pastoralists, because they don't need as much job specialization, right? So these two groups, priests and warriors, we said protect you from natural disasters, protect you from human disasters, right? Human threats and natural threats, and then everybody else. So when the Aryans came, they probably came with these three groups. Whoever the people were who were locally there, now you're group 4. Here at the bottom, we'll take the better of the everybody jobs, and you take the crappier of the everybody jobs. And we end up with Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. Later on, this will get way more complicated I don't want to get ahead of myself because I think it's probably later in the packet, but the idea of Jati and kind of subcasts and things like that. But these are the 4 rankings in the beginning, and it's an example of how cultural ideas, right, social systems, can become also part of the religious belief, right, and become kind of codified and made official by the religious teachings. I think we hit a lot of stuff for D. We probably even got ahead of other things. Interregional cultural technological exchanges grew as a result of expanding trade networks and large-scale population movements, such as Indo-Europeans and Bantu migration. Perfect. Yes. I'm so glad that this popped up there, because remember, we have to go back where? Where do we have to go back to? We go back to C, yeah. Where's the phrase? So I want from the Indo-Europeans. So the Indo-Europeans started out as a nomadic people from, we're not 100% sure, but Slavs? Yeah. So they start out as people from probably up north of the Black Sea toward the Caucasus. They are not the original white people, but there's certainly they had a huge influence on European culture, all from Europe to India, which is why we think that there are two countries in the world that have the word Aryan in their name. Anyone know? One's more obvious than the other. Country that is named for the Aryans. One of the countries is, well, they both mean land of the Aryans, at least according to some. One of them is more obvious.
Armenia.
What?
Armenia.
No, not Armenia. You can guess them. If you look at where they're going.
I have no idea.
So there was a country that they.
Iraq.
Iran, very good. Yeah, I was about to give it up. Yeah, Iran. Oh no. Iran is one of them. Iran is one of them, the land of the Aryans. The other one is Ireland.
Oh, remember, it's Aries.
Yeah. And I'm not 100% sure about that one, but I've heard said that could be the origin of it because that term seems to have been around in a lot of early Indo-European language that spread some kind of a title meaning either an ethnonym for themselves, a name that people call themselves, or a title for like nobles within the society. You have names like Ariana, stuff like that, right? Where you associate.
Irian and Brandy.
So, but these people were pastoral nomads, right? And so we can do C and we can do E in the next section, right? They were disseminators of new weapons, modern modes of transportation, and transformed warfare in agrarian. Agrarian means what? Farming, agricultural, right? So it's saying, the nomadic people, they came up with all these new things. Once that ended up with the civilizations, with the agricultural civilizations, then it really blows up, right? They take it and they run with it, literally. They roll with it, with chariots and things like that. And then in E, it's talking about the same thing that those exchanges. So we'll hit Indo-Europeans, then we'll go to Bantu. So these are the language families in Europe today. It's a cool map. And they're Indo-European, but it also spreads to the other parts of Asia. And we don't talk about this enough, but the Indo-Europeans majorly go out into Central Asia. They're not as famous because we have a strong bias against nomadic peoples and towards settled peoples, but they stay nomadic, and this is that hard land. So you have groups like the Scythians and others, the Tocharians out in Central Asia. They found like red-haired mummies in Central Asia, and they play a large role. But all these places, all the Aryans we talked about going to India, right? There, this Indo-European migration, and they settle among the people who already live in those places and mix in, and they bring their language and parts of their culture. So social structures, religion, their concepts of gods, right? And of course their language. So the chariot is one technology that comes from them. Actually, the domestication of the horse is coming from that region, from the steppe and the western side of the steppe, right? That region from like the Black Sea to the Pontic, Caspian steppe. But they start migrating out because environmental issues, overpopulation, not enough food, escape from invaders. Obviously, it's not going to be the same everywhere. But the chariot is one of their big deal inventions. Let's see. So the Hittites, right here, one of the important ones. They set up a major civilization in what is modern day Turkey. What's this territory called? Anatolia, or this region? Anatolia, aka Asia Minor, yeah. So the Hittites are there. They developed that iron technology. So that's another one. Iron technology is developed by Indo-Europeans. We think it probably started out in this homeland. The iron technology of north of the Black Sea, and then they spread further down south. That iron technology, of course, hits the Assyrians, the chariots. Egypt takes chariots and runs with it, right? So it spreads down into the Middle East and some of those settled places. Later on, we'll talk about. You guys know the people who. That's also from those Indo-Europeans who passed it on to the Hun, the Turks, the Mongols. That technology and those ideas, that lifestyle kind of gets passed on. So, let's see what else. Anything else? Hittites, Bronze Age collapse. There are some regions, and we also wanted to talk about the Bantu migration. Pull that up. So the Bantu, where's that? where's the Bantu migration happening?
Africa.
Africa. They start out in West Africa. Here, so I'll just show you this because we mentioned Nubia before, but just so you can see, right, like, you can obviously see the Egyptian influence on Nubian culture. These are much smaller than the Egyptian pyramids, but this is Meroe, one of the capitals of Nubia for one of its periods, in modern-day Sudan, and they, there's a lot of civilization there as well, and trade and sorry?
Is that the Tower of Babel?
Tower of
Babel?
No. That is, I'm not sure if it's, I think it's from Aksum, but I'm not positive. Bantu migration, right? So the people started out in this area, in kind of this corner of Africa, in West Central Africa, and they migrated out, again, environmental issues, right? Overpopulation, our usual culprits for making people want to move. But they spread, and this is not a quick thing, right? This is going to take place over the course of thousands of years. So it starts in 2000 BCE. By 1000 BCE, they've gone a pretty good ways down south. By 500 AD, 500 CE, they've kind of gone throughout this area of sub-Saharan Africa, and the Bantu language families were the largest language families in the region. So we can look right here. You can see the influence of it. And I think it's really cool. We see a similar thing in India when the Aryan languages come in, where you see pockets of the Dravidian language, and you see that here with the Khoisan languages. When you guys think of like South, if you guys heard like the click sounds that you hear in some languages in Southern Africa, right? That is not a Bantu feature, but that's a Khoisan feature. You gotta learn the rest of the language now. All right. So, but that you can see that. Look, you see that little green, right?
Yeah.
Right. So if that's that little green there, what does that suggest to us?
They migrated.
It could be, but we know that the Bantu is the orange. We know that the Bantu migration came throughout Southern Africa. If it's a big bunch of green here, but there's a few little dots of green in a few other places.
Trade.
Could be trade, but remember we're talking about this cultural fusion of this Bantu language throughout this region of Africa. So what might it have looked like before the Bantu languages come in?
All green.
Yeah, it probably was mostly green, right? So those languages probably dominated in a lot of Southern Africa, but then were replaced, and we see kind of the remnants of it. We see the same thing in India, where in the South Indian languages, the Dravidian languages are mostly in the south, but there are a few pockets, a couple in Pakistan and northern India, that suggest maybe they're leftovers. But you're right, it's possible also people migrated, and we can't tell that from language alone, but it's a hint. So one of the things here as well is iron working, right? So iron, again, this is another technology that is developed independently in more than one place. We talked about farming, we talked about writing. Iron technology is independently invented in Europe and in Africa. So that technology among the Bantu obviously gives them an edge. They, not just for fighting, right? They might be able to, in some cases, go to war with their neighbors, but very often they can outcompete people. They can accomplish more because a lot of regions in Africa are forested, and if you want to make that land productive, what do you need to do? Domesticate the ground?
Make it cultivated.
So what do you have to get rid of?
All the vegetation.
And the trees. What do you do with them?
Burn them.
So Pale people did burn them, right? But that was an early form of clearing the land. But now we have iron technology, so you can more easily, right? You don't have to light everything on fire. You can cut things down. You have tools for agriculture. It's more sturdy, more stronger metal. You can plow the ground. You can work the fields. So that's going to give them an advantage and allow them to spread. And of course, they'll share that technology as they go to different places. So iron technology goes in both directions, down from Europe to the south and also up north from sub-Saharan Africa. Iron, not to get into details, but iron is you have to really process the iron a lot to get the pure metal and get all the junk out of it. But once you figure out how to do that, it's very easy to find. So iron is cheap, which means it's going to be very democratizing in terms of access to weapons, tools, things like that. And you see the impact of that around the world. Like I said, the Assyrians, everybody can get weapons. Everybody's strapped, right? Everybody's armed. And so that makes them very formidable. militaries around the world, armies don't have to just be a few people who can afford bronze weapons, but we can arm a wider group of people. What's next? Religious beliefs. Bad, religion. We have to do social hierarchy, patriarchy, intensified, the states expanded, the cities multiplied. I think we talked about that. Did we get everything on the previous page before we go any further?
Yes. Yeah.
So we covered everything of 1, right? Of period 1. So let's try to. Should we do a little bit of? Should we stop here for today, or do you want to do a little bit of 2?
Maybe we should do 2 of them.
All right. So let's pause it here for today. Thank you guys for coming. How was it?
Good.
It's good. It's good. Only okay. Thank you for your honesty. Let me know if there's anything that we can do differently. Did you guys like the images and stuff?
Yeah.
Was that helpful? Cool.
Yeah.
I don't think I can do that. I can do that a little bit with you Q&A online, but it's I'm kind of responding. Yeah, I'm responding in the moment. But hopefully this will be good, and we'll keep doing it. I don't know what the last one will be, like we were talking about the other day. We're doing at least 4 more up until the end of until spring break. But the week we come back, I might do another week of it, depending on how far we get and what people want and everything like that. Do check out the videos that are online, though. Not just mine. I will post the Q&A and everything, but also the other ones that I share with you guys. There's an essay tomorrow in class, and I'm going to post, try to do it before I leave, some John Green videos and also a video that kind of reviews the LEQ skills, even though we've gone over it a million times. One more can't hurt. Thank you guys, and see you tomorrow.